Welcome back to Online Global Campus. Today we are honored to have Dr. Sami Honkasako, currently an assistant professor of linguistics at Nazarbayev University, Nur Sultan, Kazakhstan. And well, the topic today will be the Southwestern region. So I give the floor to you now, and you can start your presentation at your convenience, please.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming. So my name is Sami Honkasako. I'm currently here in Kazakhstan, and I'm a field worker. So methodologically, I like to collect my own data, and I typically work in Southwestern China. So I'm going to talk about this region in today's talk as well. That is titled Linguistic Diversity and Change at the Crossroads of the Tibetan and Chinese Civilizations in Southwestern China. So our goal today is to offer a perspective for the emergence and evolution of ethno-linguistic diversity in Southwestern China at the crossroads of Tibetan and Chinese civilizations. Then, with a focus on Gesitsa, that is the language I research mostly, we approach the question of rapidly progressing linguistic change and endangerment in this region. And we will indeed primarily be focusing on ethno-linguistic facts and history and sociolinguistics rather than doing, let's say, for instance, phonology and morphosyntax. There are four major parts for today's talk. First, I will define the stage together with some of the key terms, such as the polysemous Tibet itself. After this, I'll be moving to the historical background, and we explore the historical underpinnings of linguistic diversity in Southwestern China. Then, after we know about the history, we will move and inspect the present situation, namely linguistic developments that are now taking place in this region. And finally, depending how much time we have, but in any case, we will spend some time in analyzing the factors that are behind the current development that unfortunately, as we could have guessed, has in some cases and quite a few of cases resulted in linguistic endangerment. So let's start with the definitions. First of all, maps will follow, so do not worry if you're not familiar with this region. We will think of the location here. There are different definitions. We have a political definition of Southwest China that can be thought of as Sichuan and Chongqing, Yunnan, and Guizhou, and quite often the Tibet Autonomous Region included. I don't care about such political definitions in today's lecture, but for our ethno-linguistic purposes, we more narrowly define Southwestern China as the region at the crossroads of Chinese and Tibetan civilizations, primarily in what corresponds to Sichuan and Yunnan, the region being characterized by mountainous terrain and ethno-linguistic diversity. So this will be our focus today. And because of my personal experience as a field worker, most what I will be talking about concerns the particular part of this region that is called Western Sichuan. But many or even most of the remarks will apply more broadly, especially concerning the ongoing endangerment and the underlying reasons contributing to it. Okay, so if this is the geographical setting, what about Tibet then? That is also a very relevant term in this context. The term Tibet itself can be ambiguous, polysemous, and quite often ideologically loaded, thus requiring further discussion. Namely, when people talk about Tibet, which Tibet are they talking about? And actually, one of the reasons people disagree and have arguments because they are talking about Tibet while meaning different things with a word. We have something that I have termed here the political Tibet. This varies according to the historical era, of course. What is a political Tibet now was obviously different from what it was during the era of the Tibetan Empire. But now, at present, the Tibet Autonomous Region, as a part of the People's Republic of China, is political Tibet. On top of this, or in addition to this, we also have something called Greater Tibet, or the Tibetans call this Chilkaksum. That is primarily the historical Tibetan regions of Uzang, Kham, and Amdo. Again, don't worry, the maps will follow very soon. And finally, as the broadest category, we have something like ethnocultural Tibet, or Tibetan cultural era, or what I personally prefer, the Tibetosphere. So this is the broad area influenced by Tibetan culture, regardless of political divisions in our contemporary maps, comprising, for instance, as an independent state, Ladakh under India, parts of northern Nepal. So we have Ladakh, parts of northern Nepal, such as Mustang, parts of northern Myanmar, etc. So this is the widest definition of all these three different Tibets. So here you see the Tibetan Autonomous Region and also the location of Sichuan, the western parts of which will be the main focus of my talk today. Now, here you see Greater Tibet as envisioned by the Central Tibetan Administration that can be thought of as the Tibetan government in exile in Dharamsala, India. So if you compare this to what you saw, you notice immediately that this is approximately at least double the size. Finally, here we have the Tibetosphere, or the Tibetan culture sphere. I would actually argue it is probably even a little bit wider than this figure here, or this map here, but you can clearly see how it neatly crosses these contemporary borders that are sometimes drawn even somewhat artificially. Here, we must be aware that a centralized Tibetan government has never ruled over all regions of this Greater Tibet, although its formation as an independent state has become an aspiration for some Tibetan nationalists. This indeed makes it a modern nationalistic project, very similar to many other nationalistic projects that we have in the contemporary world, rather than a restoration into a previously existing state. At the same time, however, significant number of ethnic Tibetans live outside the narrowly defined Tibetan Autonomous Region that was only formally established in 1965. So three different categories for Tibet. What about languages then? When we zoom down to Western Sichuan, what kind of languages do we find in this region? Most languages spoken there can be categorized into three groups under Trans-Himalayan. I'm using the term Trans-Himalayan here, but terms such as Sino-Tibetan and Tibeto-Burman are equally used, and I don't want to enter this somewhat ideological debate here, which term is better than the others. Basically, we can think of them as more or less synonyms of the same thing. First of all, in this region, we have Sinitic languages, namely different varieties of Southwestern Mandarin, mostly, and they can be remarkably different from Standard Chinese, influenced by some other languages with which they have been in contact. So this is very different from the school Putonghua that we as foreign learners of Chinese usually learn, for instance. Then we have Tibetic languages that are usually in this region, Kham or Amdo varieties, some of which differ, or many of which I would say, differ noticeably from the more quote-unquote standard Kham and Amdo varieties. There is a traditional division of Tibetan into three dialects that are those of Uzang, Kham, and Amdo, but such a division is linguistically speaking problematic. Well, this is because although a standardized written form exists, we have something called the Yike, so a shared written standard used in many parts of the Tibetosphere, actually. Spoken Tibetan is not a single language, despite being mistaken for one quite often by Westerners and even by some linguists. But it is a branch of Trans-Himalayan with internal diversity, maybe something parallel to the Romance language branch, in Indo-European. The members of this Tibetic branch derive from Old Tibetan spoken around Yarlung Valley in regions that are now somewhat to the west from Sichuan that I will be focusing on, and somewhat closer to the political center of Lhasa. And we can identify up to 50 Tibetic languages. And if you start counting the major dialects, we get a number of over 200 dialects. So even among the Tibetic languages, there is indeed a huge diversity in existence. Finally, the third major type of languages that we find in Western Sichuan is that of the so-called Chiangic languages. And this is a proposed branch of Trans-Himalayan. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail. It would have the sub-branches of, for instance, the generally conservative Gerongic languages, also including Horpa, the different Horpa languages, then Chiang languages proper, Minyak, Tapa, and even Tangut, and so on. So there is this motley of different non-Tibetic and non-Sinitic languages, and they have been grouped together into a Chiangic branch. And some of these languages are also spoken in the areas adjacent to Sichuan, typically in Yunnan and the Tibetan Autonomous Region. So here you can see a map of some of their distribution here, kind of sandwiched between the predominantly Chinese-speaking areas and predominantly Tibetic-speaking areas. Now, the Chiangic languages are characterized by orientation prefixes. So when you use a locomotive verb or a verb of movement, you have to indicate in many of these languages the direction of movement, whether you go upwards, downwards, downriver, upriver, and so on. So it is grammaticalized and part of the verb, similar to, let's say, person indexation. There are complex consonant clusters at the syllable onset position and large consonant inventories. However, at the coda position, there is a frequent loss of Proto-Trans-Himalayan final consonants. So these languages are quite poor in final consonants. There's a major problem to the Chiangic claim, though. That is the difficulty in distinguishing areal and inherited genealogical features. For instance, Chirkova argues that the features on which the Chiangic hypothesis is built on result simply from areal diffusion, and consequently, Chiangic constitutes a linguistic area somewhat similar to well, the Ando-Sprachbund that we discussed the last time, albeit with less diversity in terms of language families, and thus not being a genealogical unit. On the other hand, recent computational phylogenetic work done with computers points towards the validity of Chiangic. Actually, some of the recent findings do highlight the possibility that Chiangic is a valid genealogical unit indeed. Also, it is worth mentioning that there is the non-overlap of ethnic and linguistic identities. Many of the minority languages speakers self-identify as Tibetans, and they largely follow the Tibetan lifestyles in the plural, because obviously there is some variety therein as well, and the Tibetan religious traditions such as Tibetan Buddhism, Bon, and so forth. Also, this self-ascription, namely how people identify themselves, namely as Tibetans, occasionally conflicts with external ascription, namely how other Tibetic-speaking Tibetans see them, because sometimes these Tibetans who think of themselves as Tibetans are considered to be ethnic traitors by those Tibetans who speak a Tibetic language, and these non-Tibetic minority languages are thus described discriminatively as Loke, as backwards language, lok here meaning something like backwards, like opposite to the normal order, and Deke, ghost language, maybe more accurately and translated as demon language. So there is also such discrimination from Tibetan speaking Tibetans towards these non-Tibetan or non-Tibetic speaking Tibetans, which obviously doesn't really help regarding the precarious situation of these languages. Now, having set the stage, let's move to the historical background. Being historically the transition zone between the Tibetan and Chinese civilizations has made Western Sichuan ethnically and linguistically extremely diverse. And this is influenced by the environment. We have river valleys that are surrounded by mountains. And we know from many pieces of research that mountainous terrain provides a fertile ground for ethno-linguistic diversity to develop. The linguistic history of this region is greatly affected by successive waves of migration, usually along river valleys surrounded by mountains that provide natural barriers with an isolating function. As more widely in other parts of the Tiberosphere as well, so this is a wider phenomenon, this leads what we can describe as a hydrographic patterning of language and population distribution. And this can be illustrated with the following Ladakhi proverb. So Ladakhi is a Tibetic language spoken in Ladakh that is now under Indian rule on the other side of the Himalayan mountains. So we have a proverb here: those who drink from the same river speak the same language. Those who drink from different rivers speak different languages. So all in all, this proverb here highlights the fact that the inhabitants of the Tiberosphere have themselves also been aware of the function of rivers in terms of linguistic diversity. And I'm just giving one sample picture here. You see the river flowing at the bottom of the valley. That is usually where people live, and also along the lower ranges of the slopes. And then you have the mountain slopes on both sides, and they go steep up, and the temperature also tends to get colder the higher up you go. So this is a typical landscape in Western Sichuan. Here, I'm illustrating this from Google Maps, taking the center of Dampa County, where I do my work, as an example. And here, when I highlight the rivers, you can see how different systems are formed. And if I also added the different languages on top of this map, you would see how clearly they follow this river system and what we just discussed in the previous slides. So what about the first languages here? The question of autochthonous languages of Southwestern China is linked with the question of Trans-Himalayan or Heimat, or original homeland, and the subsequent migration waves. The homeland of Trans-Himalayan languages, and by default then of their speakers as well, remains controversial and frequently debated. But I would argue there are two major credible approaches to the question. We have, first of all, the northern origin hypothesis, claiming that the Heimat was somewhere in what corresponds now to northern China, around the Yellow River Basin, not too far really from the origins of the Chinese civilization. And then the population speaking non-Sinitic languages migrated southwestwards towards the Himalayan mountains. Then we have the opposite hypothesis, namely the southern origin hypothesis, that postulates the opposite migration pattern, namely from somewhere in Sichuan, or even the other side of the Himalayan mountains in northwestern India, finally into more towards the north or northwest. And here you would see an illustration of the first one from a recently published paper. From the Yellow River Basin expanding southwestwards. Recent research supports the northern origin theory. Namely, Sinitic speakers remained north, while the rest of the proto-population, namely Tibeto-Burman speakers, migrated towards southwest. And this is due to two separate papers published independently of each other using computerized phylogenetic methodology. But of course, this is nothing ultimate, simply one of the first steps for a rigorous approach to this question. And regardless of which of these hypotheses, if any, is ultimately correct, the linguistic prehistory of southwestern China is directly connected to these migration waves. This doesn't exclude the yet unproven possibility of earlier populations with their non-Trans-Himalayan languages, possibly reflected as remaining substrates in the languages of southwestern China. But at this state of research, we cannot be too sure of this. But there is a non-deniable likelihood that someone was there before. Who knows? Then what we also think is that there have been earlier historical contacts between the ancestors of these Qiangic languages that are spoken in southwestern China and a language family called the Hmong-Mien, also known as Miao Yao. And this is because of some wonder-wörter proposed by Guillaume Jacques in a recent paper. For instance, in Gesitsa, we call the walnut kalo, and in this Fuyuan Hmong-Mien language, it's called klok. Or in Stao, that is also another Horpa language closely related to Gesitsa, we call bamboo, and again we have the corresponding Hmong-Mien shapes of Thlao and Thlo here. We can trace the contact to Qiangic rather than some other branches in these cases, because at least some of the cognate words are lacking in other branches of the Trans-Himalayan language family. I have to add a side note here that there are some other words in Hmong-Mien, namely some numerals that could be taken from many potential Trans-Himalayan sources. But at least in this case, the source, according to our present understanding, must be the Qiangic languages, because you won't find most of these words in other branches of Trans-Himalayan. Okay, after we got the autochthonous people in place, now we have a new way of Tibetanization and the expansion of the Tibetic languages. Many of the languages of Western Sichuan are Tibetanized, and that reflects a historical Tibetan eastwards expansion to this region. So, for instance, I've given you a map here from the region where I work. This is the map of the county I work in, Tampa. So, at the center of the map, you see this shade of blue surrounded by other colors, and it corresponds to the so-called 24 villages Patua. That is a Kham Tibetan dialect. And it is here sandwiched between Gerongic languages and highlights historical migration patterns that can be quite complex. For instance, I still don't know how they eventually ended up in this location. Importantly, Suzuki and Tassinima have recently discovered 3 non-Tibetic languages in Chamdo, that is a region of Eastern Tibet Autonomous Region. So this is hundreds of kilometers away from where I work and from where most of my colleagues work, even going directly, and a lot further if you take a road and follow the river valleys. So we are moving considerably towards the west now. We are already in the Tibet Autonomous Region, and the authors of these papers discovered the languages of Lamo, Dakyapmat, and Lajongmat. So these languages are at least Qiangic and possibly even Gerongic. However, they are spoken a lot more towards the west from what are historically and typically considered the homelands of the Qiangic and Gerongic people. What this remarkable discovery shows us is of extremely high value because it highlights the fact that Tibetan expansion eastwards is likely relatively recent, following the expansion of the Tibetan Empire by Songtsen Gampo in the 7th century onwards. So before this Tibetan expansion originating from the Yarlung Valley, many of these areas that are now Tibetic speaking might have actually been Chiangic speaking and more narrowly Jarungic speaking in their previous history. So this is probably one of the major discoveries of this millennium, or even well, this century in trans-Himalayan studies. So you can still find new quote unquote find, of course, because the languages are still known to their speakers, but as a scholar you can discover languages that are not known to the scientific community, and it still occasionally happens in the Tibetosphere. Especially now going back to the previous general discussion, in terms of lexicon, contact with Tibetic languages has been very impactful for non-Tibetic minority languages of Sichuan. And there are some typical domains of borrowing that we can identify. For instance, giving examples from Gesitsa here, we have raw materials like aser, gold coming from Tibetan ser. We have domestic animals, ayo, that comes from the Tibetan ya, and occupations like smemba coming from Tibetan memba, and religion, regambo, coming from Tibetan komba. So in some respects, the Tibetan civilization was more advanced than that of the pre-Tibetanized communities that spoke those Chiangic languages, and consequently, speakers of those languages borrowed many crops, domestic animals, ideas, religious concepts and occupations from them that is reflected in these lexical layers. This comes from Gesitsa, but you find similar lexical semantic groups from many other languages of Western Sichuan as well. Now, after the Chinese migration wave, sorry, after the Tibetan migration wave, I'd like to briefly discuss the Mongol and Uyghur migrations to the region. Western Sichuan witnessed a wave of Mongol migration in the 13th century when the Mongol Empire was expanding. So this is a relatively established fact, but additionally, there might have been a migratory wave of Uyghurs, namely so-called yellowhead Uyghurs, into the region as well. And there is some folklore in which these migration waves live on among the local populations. But of course, we have to take such accounts with a critical approach, as always. But I do think that the underlying idea of Mongol migrations to the region is correct. However, possibly due to a small number of settlers marrying locally and whose progeny quickly underwent language shift because of their numbers, the migrations have not left significant permanent trace in the regional languages. And many dubious cases can, I would argue, be explained to have arrived via Tibetan or one of the Tibetic languages instead. For instance, we have Gur in Gesitsa for tent. It looks like it comes from Mongolian get, but in reality, this comes via Tibetan, where the corresponding form is Gur, and U here in Amdo, for instance, is often or has systematically changed into an so in Amdo it would be good as well. So no need to explain such words as Mongolian loan words rather than Mongolic words that have been recycled via Tibetan. Some place names nevertheless hint about a past Mongol habitation, such as Sokpo, literally meaning Mongol, in Damba County. So there is this interesting element. Okay, we've covered the Tibetic expansion, the possible Mongol and Uyghur, or the likely Mongol and Uyghur migrations. Now it's time for the Chinese to enter the stage of the major migration waves to this region of southwestern Sichuan. That of the Han Chinese is by far the newest. And we know that Han migrations to the West have a long history. For instance, there is a famous war called the War of the Heavenly Horses, whereby the Han expanded into the Fergana Valley in Central Asia, somewhere around, I think, 104 to 102 or 1 BC. So there is this historical pattern of westward movement by the Han Chinese. But the Han Chinese migration into Western Sichuan took its first major steps only during the Qing dynasty. So I'm not claiming they were the first people to migrate. I'm only claiming that the migration pattern started to become significant during this dynasty only, so in recent history. This contact resulted in introduction of many new plants, most notably corn and potato, which now play an important role in the crop economy of Western Sichuan. And corn and potato, of course, originally come from Americas, from the Americas. So it also shows that, or puts some kind of a chronological limit to how early they could have been introduced into the region, and how early the words corresponding to those could have been introduced. So the Finnish migration did have also quite major impacts on the societies in Western Sichuan, especially in terms of agricultural patterns. Now, this contact intensified after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, and especially then at the beginning of the Open Up the West program that triggered intentional modernization at around the beginning of this new millennium, around 20 years ago. So the Chinese state wants to modernize less developed western parts of the country, because a lot of the development has centered around the coastal areas that have been the beneficiaries of the Chinese economic miracle, and the Open Up the West program corresponds to this. Well, as a result, contact varieties of Chinese have emerged, and often relatively recently. So I would say, and quite often, features of the local languages are reflected in the contact varieties. For instance, in the following example of Southwestern Mandarin of Namba County. In so-called Standard Mandarin or Putonghua, we would say, "Ni chu nali?" Where are you going? But in the Namba Southwestern Mandarin, people would say, "Ni lerchi, ni lerchi." So you notice, for instance, that this is verb final here. There are no tones. I cannot rule out the existence of tones for some speakers, but at least there are speakers with no tones. So this is a considerably different version of Mandarin from what we are used to from the quote-unquote school Mandarin, Putonghua. Now, let's move and inspect the situation at present. Analyzing the trends in language shift in Eastern Tibetosphere shows an ongoing trend. The language shift has a geographical basis. So here, we don't have to talk about Western Sichuan only. We can take even a wider approach, including all the way the landscape up to Qinghai. So there is a geographical pattern, namely, languages of the region form two groups depending whether the major shift is occurring into Chinese or Tibetan, according to the claims and proposals by Gerald Rush. And we can see this here. So there is a red line on the map, and languages on the right, namely on the eastern side, are shifting into Chinese, whereas languages on the right, namely on the western side, are shifting into Tibetan. And this is obviously a simplification, and we have to go into more details in the future. But this neatly captures the geographical and historical trend that we saw, namely the centuries-long expansions of both the Chinese and the Tibetan civilizations into this liminal area between the civilizations. So history is clearly reflected here in the ongoing language shift. What are the linguistic results emerging from this then? I'm just going to give you a few examples. There is, of course, major code switching and constant code switching going on, also massive borrowing, and the occasional relexicalization that results from it. And now I am becoming a little bit more speculative, but this might trigger the emergence of so-called mixed languages as a bridge in ultimate language shift, namely having mixed languages with non-Sinitic grammatical core retained, then with largely Sinitic lexicon as a result of this relexicalization. Of course, direct and rapid shift without this intermediary mixed language stage is also possible and even likely in several cases where the engagement is of especially rapid and serious nature. Let's have an example of one Gesitsa utterance here, highlighting the Chinese elements in bold. Switching and borrowing, it is also quite often difficult when those speakers are de facto bilingual or almost bilingual. But nevertheless, you can see in this most of the words are already Chinese. There are 1, 2, 3 Gesitsa elements contrasting with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Chinese elements. And even though this is quite an extreme case and not all utterances are so heavily influenced by Chinese, this is nevertheless at the same time nothing absolutely unusual either. There is the rapid loss of vitality. The process of endangerment seems to happen occasionally with alarming speed, even in a matter of decades rather than centuries. For instance, in Gesitsa, the Horpa language that I researched myself, major endangerment has only taken place maybe since the beginning of this, so in around 20 years. And there are other anecdotal examples from other contexts of such fast loss of vitality. For instance, Narpu in Nepal, when analyzed and conducted fieldwork on in 1996, appeared quite vital. Several years afterwards, in 2001, apparently many of the young had already almost completely shifted into Nepali in half a decade. Now, finally, let's think about the factors behind the current development. We have double marginalization. So we already saw that the minority languages of Western Sichuan are at the margins when seen from the core areas of both Tibetan and Chinese civilization. So we have to understand this double nature of their marginalization. These Qiangic languages, and they are not marginalized only from the viewpoint of Chinese, but also from the viewpoint of the Tibetic, many of the Tibetic languages as well. And such double marginalization obviously makes their standing even more precarious. There is obviously the question of prestige or the lack of it, which we have already discussed in this lecture series previously. And we could term this as being at the bottom of a multi-layer totem pole. It needs to be noted that prestige, language shift, and linguistic dominance in Western Sichuan is not binary, sorry for the typo, but far more complex. So there are not only two elements to analyze about a complex network. What I mean by this is, for instance, that Tibetic languages are simultaneously being threatened by Chinese, and at the same time, while being threatened, they themselves may be exerting pressure on the non-Tibetic languages of the region. The following slides illustrate the situation from a language called Niagarong Minyak, that is a Horpa language of Western Sichuan, somewhat related to Gesitsa, quite closely related to Gesitsa. So here we have different languages spoken in the linguistic ecosystem of that language. We have Standard Mandarin or Putonghua, and then the version of Sichuanese Mandarin or Southwestern Mandarin. Then we have standard or standardized Tibetan, whatever that means. Well, we could think of it maybe as the written standard, highly revered by the Tibetans and also constituting their religious language. Or we can also think of this as a more standardized version of the Kham Tibetan language. Then there is a local Kham dialect, highly divergent one called Nyakke or Nyakke. I don't know the local pronunciation. And finally, we have Niagarong Minyak itself, the Horpa language. So we have 5 players in this linguistic ecosystem. So we can see how the standard Chinese language dominates Sichuanese Mandarin, and that in turn dominates the standard Tibetan, that in turn dominates the Nyakke dialect of Tibetan, and finally that dominates Niagarong Minyak. Dominates here just being a shortcut to mean equals higher prestige, higher association with power, being the targeting language shift, and so on. Of course, well, this is a great simplification, but it does capture some patterns in the society or in the linguistic ecosystem. But now you see the picture is a lot more complex, because at the same time, this standard Mandarin not only dominates over Sichuanese Mandarin, but all the other languages that are lower in the totem pole, so to speak, namely standard or standardized Tibetan and Nyakke and Niagarong Minyak. And then Sichuanese Mandarin, in turn, does the same, except that it has no force to dominate over standard Mandarin. And when you go further down, you see that at the bottom of this linguistic ecosystem, we find Niagarong Minyak, and at the very top, as the quote-unquote alpha language, we can identify Putonghua or standard Mandarin. There is the interesting factor of electrification and digitalization. Orator, also known as oral literature, that is an oxymoron in many respects, such as stories, songs, local histories, anecdotes, etc., has now been replaced by Chinese medium entertainment offered by television and the internet, which results in domain and speech genre loss. Because if there is no performance of orator due to its oral nature, it eventually disappears when there are no performers left anymore. And because there are some genres that belong to orator, when orator disappears, those speech genres, possibly with their specific lexicons or lexica, disappear as well. And as an interesting and maybe societally sad side effect, this has resulted in the lowering prestige and authority of the elderly that were traditionally the guardians of such oral culture. And now, let's say the youngsters prefer WeChat, internet, and the television, instead of listening to their elderly telling stories and singing songs in the evening after a day's hard work. So the societal prestige of these elderly figures has consequently then lowered as a result of this. There are development projects widely in China. For instance, the Open Up the West program has been a major watershed here that we already discussed. And many of these development projects are dealing with hydropower. And obviously they have environmental repercussions, but not only environmental, but cultural or cultural linguistic as well. For instance, going back to the Nyagdong Minyak, the whole Nyagdong Minyak community might require relocation due to an ongoing hydropower project that will inundate their homeland in the future. And obviously, as a result of such relocation, it will be very hard to maintain the language intergenerationally in a new environment that is dominated by speakers of some other languages. There are changes in material culture. For instance, many traditional objects are being replaced by mass-produced modern objects that are introduced by the Chinese, by the Han Chinese. And this has also caused what we could term as a plastic avalanche with considerable environmental effects that are only starting to take place now. In the past, you used something and then you just discarded it. It returned back to the nature by virtue of having been made out of wood or so forth. Plastic doesn't have the same properties, unfortunately. Since the traditional lexicon connected to these objects that are now being forgotten and totally discarded is largely forgotten, this is sometimes characterized as lexical diminishment. Of course, we have to be aware here that this is only partially true because new objects are introduced and the objects typically come together with new words. So lexical diminishment has the smell of value judgment a little bit, but I do understand the argument and there is a point in it. So what disappears? Just two examples. These two objects that were used several decades ago are now considered worth to be placed in a museum by the Gesitsa now. We have a skelda, a pestle, or call, a wooden plow. Nobody uses these anymore. Instead, what is being introduced is this. And together with all these different objects, you will get a Chinese name for each one of them as well. Then there is education. Compulsory education has been in existence in China also before, but it's now becoming different is that it's been enforced. You cannot play truant without being subject to hefty fines that are enforced, for instance. And the parents are also becoming increasingly conscious of the value of education regarding the future of the children. So compulsory education takes place in Chinese or in some limited contexts in Tibetan, meaning teaching the school children or the pupils the standardized literary language or Yike. The minority languages, on the other hand, be they minority Sinitic languages or minority Tiangic languages or minority Tibetic languages, are invisible in the education system that further enhances the position of Chinese at the upper end of the totem pole, and also to an extent the status of written Tibetan as well. And as I've noticed myself, language shift often starts already at kindergarten already. For instance, when I conducted my fieldwork, there was a daughter of my hosting family, and before going to the kindergarten, she used to talk to me in Gesitsa, and in a couple of months after going to kindergarten, she shifted over to Chinese and she started speaking in Chinese, even though I had more difficulties in understanding her Sichuanese Mandarin than her previous Gesitsa. So I already mentioned a little bit about this. This promotion of standard Chinese not only endangers the non-Sinitic languages, but also many Sinitic divergent varieties of Southwestern Mandarin. And no one seems to be, or no one seems to care really. Even most linguists are not paying any major attention to the Sinitic minority languages of this region. There are, for instance, and due to an ongoing Horpa boom, 4 major grammars about the Horpa languages published in the recent years, but as far as I know, none about the local divergent Sinitic varieties that are equally becoming endangered, may go extinct in the near future, and would be of great value for understanding language contact and also the diversity of the Sinitic languages. Finally, I will talk about the role of the state and diverge a little bit. Here we have a stela set up by Ramses III, and we are traveling to Egypt now. That states, he, meaning the pharaoh, makes their speech disappear and changes their tongues. Well, Ramses III, that lived approximately 1,100 so and so years before the Common Era, forcibly acculturated thousands of Libyan prisoners of war that had settled into the Nile Delta and Fayum area. So in Egypt, this has been historically the area with a lot of language contact, people coming from Libya across the Mediterranean, as we know from the Sea Peoples, and also from the Middle East via the land bridge. And then there has been more linguistic diversity in this region than in Upper Egypt. So what we do have here is the earliest attested historical document, as far as I was able to find, describing a state-induced language shift and linguistic engineering from more than 3,000 years before the present time. So there is really nothing new under the sun. While nation states are generally associated with historical processes resulting in the creation of the so-called Westphalian system, ancient Egypt, with its centralized rule, at least part of the time of its history, and notion of a unified Egyptian ethnicity, is occasionally characterized as the first nation state in world history. And from the quote, we can see that nation states have generally exerted deleterious influence on linguistic diversity as long as they have existed. And the same pattern is attested in contemporary China as well. China is an empire that has cast itself as a nation state. And as a result of this, it deals with questions of linguistic diversity like a nation state does, not like an empire. Empires having been typically more tolerant of linguistic diversity, as we have discussed earlier in this lecture series. And the non-recognition of the minority languages erases them from public discourse and practice, such as education. And we also have the criminalization of language activism, as we know from some relatively recent pieces of news. However, I'd like to end things with a positive end note. Not all is lost, of course. And in the discussion part, we can talk about what can be done to maintain the linguistic diversity that characterizes Western Sichuan. And here you can see the bibliography for those who want to discover the topic further on. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you very much. And now we have plenty of time for discussion, questions, or comments. So please.
Okay. Hello.
Hello.
Okay. All right. I have a question about the children at school. Do they learn Chinese, and do their teachers speak Chinese? They watch, they read, and they do everything in Chinese, right?
Yes, that's a great question. It depends where you are in Western Sichuan and to which ethnicity you belong. So we have 2 major types of schools. We have the Chinese medium schools there, and we have some Tibetan medium schools. So if you go to a Chinese medium school, you study all the subjects theoretically in standard Mandarin or Putonghua. However, many of the teachers themselves are not fully proficient in that language form, so they will teach either in a mixture of Sichuanese Mandarin or Southwestern Mandarin. Then there is English that is taught in Chinese medium, and in some cases, I think you can study literally Tibetan as a side or as a optional subject as well. But then it is also possible to send your children to a Tibetan medium school in some cases, and there, at least theoretically, the focus will be in acquiring the written Tibetan language, or Yike. So the school books will be in Tibetan, but the higher you go in the education system, the more Chinese dominated it will be. So for instance, universities, but also high schools. And that is why there are many families who prefer the Chinese medium path, because it also helps the entrance then into a Chinese medium university.
Okay, thank you. And I have more question about my research is about finding the factor that that language shift, and I want to ask you about what factor that prevent them from shifting their language. What is the most factor? Oh, but I think the weakest factor. Okay.
So what is the most important factor stopping language shift from happening, right?
Yes, that's right. Okay.
Historically, I would say it is isolation in many senses of the term. There has been this geographical isolation before, cars and modern public transportation, and these modern roads being built. So this kind of physical, geographical isolation, and isolation also in the sense that there was less contact with other languages and speakers of other languages. There has always been quite a remarkable amount of contact. We cannot make any mistake about this, even in the past. But it hasn't been as intensive as now, when people, let's say, live in a village where they speak their native tongue and then work part of the day in the county town, for instance, where they have to speak Sichuanese Mandarin to survive. So we have this like intensification of contact that is the opposite of isolation. And also this internet and television or electrification is also an opposite manifestation, bringing an end to this isolation. So I think this isolating factor has been an important factor at play in protecting language shift previously.
Yes, this is a good answer, because in my research I have found this factor too, because every village I have found a village that they live isolated from away from the city, and the people, the children have to live there for about 18 years, and then they will leave the village. So that keep them can speak their language. Okay, thank you very much.
So now, just to add a little bit, now many pupils move to the county towns because previously China had the policy of village schools in this region, namely a policy of establishing schools in villages so that students could or pupils could study locally. However, that policy has been discontinued due to new policies of centralized education in the county towns. So what this means, quite often the villages can be far away from the county towns or the political local centers. So families rent or even buy, if they are wealthy enough, apartments in the county towns. So instead of living in the village, let's say 1 or 2 grandparents move to the county town and spend all of their time there. And obviously, in this new environment, the children, they speak Chinese at school and also Chinese after school, because it's likely going to be the standard or the major language of the county town. And this kind of stops the isolation that existed in the village environment.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
There is a question.
Question in the chat. So I can read it out loud for you. So the question concerns Tibetan. For example, is that Tibetan or minor languages in textbook, social media, radio program in the area?
Yes, we have Tibetan TV programs, and I think we have radio programs as well, but nobody seems to be listening them too much. There are Tibetan language songs at least, and people do listen to them a lot. And there are Tibetan books and Tibetan newspapers. But Tibetan here refers mostly to Yike or written Tibetan. So it is present, and however, as we've seen for many, this type of Tibetan, like for the Gesitsa, is also a foreign language because it is absolutely different, only very, very, very distantly related. Moreover, I think the budget for creating TV programs, for instance, in the Tibetan language medium is not as high as in Chinese language medium. So the quality of these programs is not always as high as that of the Chinese. But standard Tibetan or written Tibetan is still quite solidly present in this region, especially the more west you go, the more you go towards the Tibetan heartland, the more you see the presence of Tibetan. And also, Tibetan is, for many, the religious language. So even speakers of Chiangic languages who have no idea of any Tibetic language, nevertheless often know how to pray in Tibetan. So there is this domain-specific use of Tibetan. They know some mantras, for instance, in Tibetan. So it has such prestige. And this prestige, the connection with the religion, is indeed one of the factors that helps at least this variety of Tibetan, namely standardized Tibetan or the literally Tibetan, to maintain some level of vitality. So second question.
Yeah, so about the role of Tibetan, whether it can be used to fit with the present world context, like using for medicine, IT, or engineering, science.
I would say yes. So when we talk about, again, standardized Tibetan, there is no problem. And there is even a very long medicinal tradition among the Tibetans themselves. But of course, that is traditional medicine. So now we're talking about modern fields of study. There are many neologisms. And then there is the question of the exile community in Dharamsala. So there are some figures coining neologisms for scientific purposes. But this is completely different from the minority languages, namely something like Gesitsa or Stau, that are not even written. So the way in those languages we express modern notions is orally and by means of borrowing, typically from Chinese. So all in all, that would be my answer. And it is completely possible to express modern knowledge by means of Tibetan, even though not everyone knows those coined words yet.
Yeah, and the last point is about the situation of Western languages in this area, English or some other possible Western or European languages.
This is a great question. The Chinese government in this region and all over the country is putting increasing importance in teaching English from an early age. Basically, English is becoming increasingly important, and not only that, it is not only something superimposed on the population, but among the Gesitsa, I've noticed, for instance, that many parents have somehow associated English with modernity and greater job opportunities. So they wish that their children study English hard as well. For instance, I've been asked to teach English a little bit for some of the pupils in the families I work in. Of course, after I'd done that, when they go to school, they come back very unhappy, saying, "What did you teach me? Like, my teacher said that everything you've taught me was wrong." So, yeah, but English, yeah, because that just highlights the quality of English education. So there's a gap between the ideal and actual execution of it. So it's still difficult to get a high level of English education, and very few people have a good comment of English or any other foreign language. Foreign here being defined as a non language or a language of other than the country of China. So I don't see French being taught in primary schools, for instance, or Spanish and so on. Like, there are no cases at all of that kind. But I do see this emerging trend of English competence gradually increasing in this part of the world as well, when it's becoming integrated more strongly into the global system. So it is an ongoing trend, and the situation will likely be very, very different in 20 to 50 years among the young of this region.
I have another question, and I want to ask about their parents. Do their parents care that if their children can't speak their language, or what if the children shift their language? How about the?
Again, a very important question. I see many parents lamenting the fact that their language is noticeably disappearing. So they notice it when they compare the way they speak, the way their parents speak, and then the way their children speak. They see this gradual change, and it brings sadness. So people do care about this fact that the languages are disappearing. So the language attitudes among most of these languages, and this has also been documented a little bit by Gerald Ross, are quite positive. So fortunately, we don't have a scenario where the locals would have extremely negative attitudes towards their own languages. Of course, there is a limit to their agency, namely what they can do in this situation, especially when we have these restrictions, some of which are imposed by the nation state. But in general, the language attitudes are positive, and yes, it is quite often discussed as an outsider in this region. It is indeed one of the first topics that many strangers would mention when meeting me and addressing me, let's say, at the bus station and so forth.
Okay, and one more question from me. And
sure.
Do they still preserve their culture?
Yes.
Which one go first, or language or culture? Which one will go first in your experience?
Yeah, I would say in my experience, it is the language that goes first. They are intertwined, but the language goes first, and the culture seems to be more resilient. It is becoming synestheticized in some respects as well, but I can envision a future where, for instance, the Gesitsa have largely shifted into speaking some form of Chinese, but have still maintained major parts of their religious tradition and well, their festivities and so forth. But of course, the linguistic endangerment has a deleterious effect on the culture as well. But I see the local version or versions, we should really use the plural, of Tibetan cultures as more resilient than the languages.
Well, so in the meantime, when people are still thinking, I have one kind of opinion question for you, because I have been discussing this issue with some colleagues who like follow the situation in different areas in China. What do you think about the modern pandemic situation, whether it helps, how to say, preserving languages, or whether it accelerates or whether it slows down the language shift? Because as we discussed, that kind of isolation, especially nowadays, is more or less a kind of a social isolation, except those who have gone through this electrification. Of course, they can follow like social media on their device, but for those who are still living traditional lives without electrification, for example, how do you see the relation between a pandemic situation and language situation in southwestern China?
That is a very interesting question, and my first answer would be that it partially depends on how long this abnormal new normal continues. Also, actually, electrification starts to be quite ubiquitous. So we don't have, at least in Western Sichuan, that many, let's say, pastoral or nomad pastoral communities with no access to electricity. So that is becoming very rare. You can find more of those in the Tibetan or Tibet Autonomous Region proper. So as you already mentioned a little bit in your question setting, people now do have this alternative access. You are isolated, but you have WeChat that many Chinese use almost continuously, the same way people in the or Facebook, for instance, and that way the linguistic stimulus continues. So you still get this continuous exposure, let's say, to standard Mandarin, even while being isolated. So all in all, I would say that at the macro level, when you look at this region as a whole, this pandemic won't have a major role in slowing down the ongoing language shifts, but well, it might have some quote-unquote positive effects, but especially if this is going to be a phenomenon of several years, the long-lasting effects will be limited.
Well, when was your last trip to this area? Before pandemic, I suppose it's before pandemic, right?
Yeah, before it was in 2018, actually. Yes. So, and it is very fascinating to see how things change. Mobile paying technology in Western Sichuan, as all over in China, is more developed than what we have in Europe. Also, I noticed that in Africa already more than 5 years ago, in Eastern Africa with M-Pesa, for instance, they have a far more evolved mobile paying technology. So I saw, for instance, one Gesitsa paying for the noodles using, I think, his mobile phone. So such things are becoming commonplace even in that part. And I can only guess how things have evolved and developed further in this few years that I've been away from the field, because this part of China, at the crossroads of these two major cultural spheres of Tibet and the Han Chinese, is undergoing extremely rapid transformations. Transformations that have taken even centuries in Europe, for instance, are now being carried out in several decades, like in a fast-forward fashion. So by spending a couple of decades in these areas, you can really see like a total transition of societies that otherwise would be absolutely impossible during the lifetime, or at least very difficult during the lifetime of a person. And maybe that is also one of the positive aspects of working in this particular region, gaining new insights.
Maybe I can add to my question. So what about the road networks or like railway networks? Is it going to be like more expansive towards this area to the west?
To an extent, many of the arteries, I think, have already been established, and many of them do follow some old paths and road that have existed even for centuries in the past. But now the difference is that they have become paved and made into major highways. There is a very interesting element to this because road building and bridge building seems to contribute to language shift. I have a colleague who goes by the English name Herbert, a native speaker of Stau, one of the Horpa languages. And he told me about a scenario where there is a river, and on both sides of the river, there are Stau-speaking communities. And this, we have to note, this is more towards the Tibet Autonomous Region from Tampa, from where I do fieldwork with Kesitsa. So this is a more heavily Tibetanized area. A road was built, I think it was on the right-hand side, looking towards the west. And in several decades, those communities that were on that side of the river changed into the local variety of Tibetan. However, we have the other side of the river not connected by a bridge or not connected by a road. And those communities that were within, I would guess, I haven't been there, but within a visual distance, like there was probably almost visual contact between the communities, maintained their style without language shift. And here, I think the only reasonable way to argue for this divergence in development is simply to take into account the new highway that had been built that increased the number of interaction on the other side of the river, while the other side remained in the old paradigm, so to speak. And so I think roads are very important in that respect, that they fasten interactions between people and enable people to interact from communities that previously did not interact. And in those interactions, we need a lingua franca, and the typical lingua franca in Western Sichuan is Sichuanese Mandarin. In some areas, you can try with Tibetic language as well, but typically it is Chinese. So the establishment of the road network, and importantly, not only its establishment, because as I said, it has sometimes pre-existed, but the improvement of it by paving clearly contributes to a larger number of contacts and to language shift.
Right, I have heard of that kind of scenario is becoming more and more common in the world.
Yeah, well, that's interesting.
The dialects of two kind of county cities are more in contact with each other than the kind of local unconnected village, which might by distance could be closer to one county city, but because they are not connected by road, so they are kept separate linguistically.
Interesting to think indeed that this anecdote by my colleague reflects an ongoing pattern, so to speak. Maybe something could be done about this as well. An interesting study. There's a question now.
General question that whether there are public signs in Tibetan, Mandarin, or English in this area? What kind of language is present in linguistic landscape? Yeah, right.
This is an excellent question. This is a great question. To an extent, it depends. So I will give you some further examples. But all signage put by the Chinese state is at least in Chinese, as far as I'm aware, in this part of the country. Quite often, there is also a Tibetan toponym, for instance, that usually. So almost tragic or fun fact is that in those areas where people don't speak a Tibetic language, but are nevertheless considered ethnic Tibetans, those Tibetan place names, they are artificial constructions by some Chinese committees. So the local toponym that is, let's say in a Qiangic language, is forcefully converted into the Tibetan alphabet and then Tibetanized that way. So that way, in a way, the local language is present via Tibetan, but because none of these have any well-established writing systems, the local minority languages have never any presence in the linguistic landscapes. The question of English is very important and interesting. In some areas, such as the Tampa County, English is becoming increasingly prevalent. So you find English signage together with Chinese and possible Tibetan. And the quality varies, of course, from well-formed signs to something that probably comes from Google or Baidu Translate. So your mileage may vary. And there are some tourism hotspots because Western Sichuan is a domestic hotspot of Chinese tourism, also subject to some foreign tourism as well. So some of these places have become monetized. And for instance, in the valley next to Gesitsa Valley, where I conduct my field work, there is another valley, Nielga, and is become famous for its natural beauty, architecture, and also for the beauty of its ladies. And people, or I think it's the government actually, has consequently put some signs, not only in English, but if I remember correctly, so in addition to Tibetan and Chinese and English, there are signs in Korean, Japanese, and at least French among the European languages that kind of taps into this tourism industry. But this is, of course, exceptional. So to sum up, Chinese everywhere, Tibetan in quite many places, Tibetan meaning literally Tibetan, regardless whether those toponyms are original or just formed from something else. English seen occasionally, the local minoritized languages always not present in the linguistic landscapes.
So I can maybe ask like one last question. So sure. Concerning religions, so I suppose the majority of population that Buddhist, at least those who speak Tibetic languages or Qiangic languages. But what about those whose mother tongue is Sichuanese, for example, like the Han population in this area, whether they follow the mainstream Chinese culture, or whether they are somehow connected to the local practice, religious practice?
Okay, this is an interesting question. First of all, I am not fully sure that Buddhism dominates. I think it probably does, but in this part of the Tibetosphere, the Burn religion has actually a very strong presence. So parts of the Gesitsa Valley are almost fully burned, and there are some villages that are Yellow Hat or Gelugpa in Tibetan Buddhism. But this Bön religion is very dominant, especially among some of the Gerongic communities. And then there is, of course, Tibetan Buddhism. And what is also a major characteristics of the religions there is syncretism. So people follow different religious traditions simultaneously. Even those who are Bön invite Buddhist monks to their village to do some chanting and worship the holy mountains and potentially revere their ancestors and so on. So it all gets intermixed. When it comes to the Han population, so those who are ethnic Han Chinese, the situation, I don't have that much knowledge about concerning their situation, but if we go towards a little bit more towards the beginning, or let's say the easternmost parts of Western Sichuan, there are clearly some Han Chinese who are followers of Buddhism. So I would extrapolate from here that the same applies also to the more western parts of Western Sichuan, namely many being followers of Buddhism. And I don't see, for instance, that many Taoist or Confucian shrines around, which would also highlight the prevalence of Buddhism. But this is all simply based on my personal impressions while traveling in this region. So I would guesstimate Buddhism to dominate. It doesn't have to be the same type of Buddhism, and quite often it is indeed not. It is rather Chinese Buddhism in some cases. And for instance, the Gesitsa have a different word for the temple of the Chinese Buddhists. Argemba is a temple for the Tibetans, Tibetan Buddhists, or in some cases for the Bumpa. But then there is Jargumba, Harja, meaning Chinese, and they use this word to refer to the Chinese shrines and temples, highlighting this perceived difference between the in-group and out-group, even in religious terms.